Have you ever heard a sound that didn't just hit your ears but felt like it was trying to crawl underneath your skin? A sound that made every instinct you didn't know you had scream at you to run, even when your eyes couldn't see a thing? That's how it started for me. And if you're planning on taking that high-paying security gig out in the North Carolina backcountry, you need to listen to every word I'm about to say. My name is Henry Johnson, and 3 years ago, I was just a guy from San Francisco trying to keep my head above water. We had a baby on the way. The rent in the Bay Area was a joke, and when I saw a listing for private security at an industrial site near Bladenboro, I didn't ask why the pay was 4 times the market rate. I packed my gear, kissed my wife goodbye, and drove east, thinking I was just going to be bored out of my mind in the woods for 6 months. The site was a massive, decommissioned textile warehouse situated at the edge of the Bladen Lake State Forest. It was deep autumn, and the air was deathly calm, not a breath of wind to stir the fallen leaves, which made every step sound like a gunshot in the silence. I remember the first night I pulled up to the gate. The fog was so thick it felt like driving through wet wool. My hobby back home was bow hunting, so I wasn't exactly a stranger to the woods at night, but these woods felt different. They felt heavy, like they were holding a secret they weren't quite ready to tell yet. The warehouse itself was a relic of rusted, corrugated steel and shattered glass, surrounded by a chain-link fence that looked like it had been chewed on by something massive. I was stationed in a small, elevated guard shack near the main loading bay. My only companions were a thermos of black coffee, a heavy-duty mag light, and my Remington 870 standard issue for deterring trespassers. For the first week, the most exciting thing that happened was a raccoon tripping a motion light. But on the 8th night, the temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted until I could see my breath inside the shack, even with the heater humming. I was doing my 2 a.m. perimeter check when I smelled it. The scent of something sweet and rotting, like a carcass left in a sugar vat. I stopped near the edge of the woods, my flashlight cutting a weak beam through the mist. That's when the mimicry began. From the darkness of the pines, I heard a voice. It wasn't a growl or a hoot. It was my wife's voice. "Henry? Can you help me? I'm so cold." My heart stopped, and for a split second, the rational part of my brain just died. I almost stepped toward the trees, my hand reaching out for a woman who was 3,000 miles away. Then I saw the eyes. They weren't low to the ground like a wolf's, but nearly 9 feet up, reflecting my light with a dull, sickly yellow glow. The creature stepped partially into the light, and my lungs seized. It was a nightmare of skin and bone, so gaunt its ribs looked like they were going to burst through its translucent grayish flesh. It had the head of something that might have once been a deer, but the antlers were jagged and asymmetrical, and its face was a tattered mask of human and beast. It didn't have lips, just a row of long yellowed teeth that chattered together in the still air. It didn't attack, it just watched me, its elongated limbs twitching with a frantic, nervous energy. I raised the Remington, my hands shaking so hard the barrel danced. But the thing just tilted its head and whispered my name again in that perfect, haunting imitation. Then, with a speed that defied its skeletal frame, It vanished back into the blackness of the pines without making a single sound. I didn't sleep a wink for the rest of that shift, sitting in the guard shack with the Remington across my knees and every light in the place turned to full blast. I tried to tell myself it was a bear with mange, or maybe some local meathead in a costume trying to scare the city guard away, but deep down, I knew that was a lie. Bears don't stand 9 feet tall, and they certainly don't call you by name using your wife's exact pitch and cadence. When the sun finally bled through the Carolina pines, I drove straight to the local diner in Bladenboro, desperate for human noise and the smell of grease to wash away the scent of rot. I met a man there named Silas, a retired logger who looked like he'd been seasoned by decades of hard winters. He saw me staring into my coffee, my hands still tremorsome, and he sat down across from me without being asked. "You're the new guy at the old Millis warehouse, aren't you?" he asked, his voice like gravel grinding together. I nodded, and before I could even describe what I saw, he leaned in and whispered, "If you hear your kin calling from the trees, you don't answer, and you don't follow." He told me then about the hunger, the spirit that crawls into a man's soul when he tastes the salt of human blood during a starving winter. He called it the Wendigo, a name I'd only ever seen in horror movies, but coming from him, it felt like a death sentence. "It's been dormant for years," Silas muttered, "but the construction noise from the new bypass must have woken it up." He reached into his pocket and handed me a small, weathered leather pouch tied with sinew. "Burn some of the dried sage inside if it gets close, and for God's sake, Henry, don't let it see you're afraid. It feeds on the dread before it ever touches the meat." I took the pouch, feeling like a fool for believing in folk magic, but I tucked it into my tactical vest anyway. I should have quit right then, but Sarah had sent me a picture of the sonogram that morning, and the medical bills were stacking up like cordwood. I couldn't walk away from the paycheck. When I returned for my 10th night, the calm weather had turned oppressive. The air felt thick, like it was saturated with iron, and the silence was so absolute it felt like my ears were ringing. Around midnight, the power to the perimeter lights flickered once, twice, and then died completely, plunging the warehouse into a void. I reached for the radio to call the main office, but all that came through was a low, rhythmic clicking, the sound of teeth snapping together. Then, the heavy steel door of the warehouse, which I had personally padlocked an hour prior, began to groan. Something was pulling on it from the outside, but not with hands. It sounded like long, serrated claws were being dragged down the metal, a screeching sound that made my teeth ache. I climbed out of the guard shack, the mag light in one hand and the shotgun in the other, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking in the cold air. The scratching stopped instantly. From the roof of the warehouse, right above my head, I heard the sound of a child crying, a sound so pitiful and raw it tugged at my gut despite the terror. I looked up, and the beam of my light caught a pair of impossibly long, grey legs dangling over the edge of the gutter. They were backwards jointed, like a goat's, and the skin was sloughing off in wet patches. The creature didn't wait this time. It leapt. It didn't fall like a heavy animal. It seemed to glide through the air, a mass of shadow and bone. I fired the Remington. The muzzle flashed, blinding me for a second, but I felt the thud of something heavy hitting the gravel just feet away from me. As my vision cleared, I saw it. Hunched over, its spine arcing like a jagged mountain range, its face mere inches from mine. It didn't smell like a forest. It smelled like an open grave. The impact of the creature hitting the ground sent a vibration through the gravel that I felt in my very marrow. I didn't wait for it to stand. I pumped the slide of the Remington and fired again, the buckshot tearing into the creature's shoulder. It let out a sound that I can only describe as a tea kettle whistle mixed with a human death rattle, high, piercing, and utterly devoid of life. It didn't retreat. Instead, it lunged, a blur of grey limbs that swiped the shotgun clean out of my hands with a force that nearly snapped my wrists. I scrambled backward, tripping over a rusted iron pallet as the creature loomed over me. Up close, the lore Silas had mentioned became a sickening reality. I could see the way its skin was stretched so thin it was translucent. It wasn't just hungry. It was a living embodiment of famine. Its fingers were elongated, ending in black, needle-sharp talons that were stained with something dark and dried. It opened its maw, and I realized it wasn't just mimicking my wife's voice. It was wearing the sounds it had stolen. "Henry, stay still. It only hurts for a second." It hissed, the voice now a horrific mashup of Silas, my wife, and my own frantic breathing from moments before. Just as it leaned in, its breath cold enough to frost my jacket, a bright flare hissed through the dark. It struck the creature's chest, erupting in a shower of magnesium-white sparks. The Wendigo shrieked, backing away as it clawed at the burning chemicals. "Get up, you damn fool!" a voice barked. It was Silas. He was standing near the warehouse entrance, holding a modified flare gun in one hand and a heavy wood axe in the other, his face set in a mask of grim determination. I didn't need to be told twice. I lunged for my shotgun, but the creature was faster, recovering from the shock and swiping at the air between us. Silas threw a second flare, not at the beast but at a patch of dry brush and oil-soaked rags near the loading dock. The fire caught instantly, creating a wall of heat and light between us and the thing. "Inside, now!" Silas yelled, grabbing me by the collar of my tactical vest and hauling me toward the heavy steel door. We slammed the door shut and slid the iron crossbar just as a massive weight slammed into the other side. The metal dented inward, the screech of claws against steel sounding like a saw cutting through bone. We were in the main warehouse floor now, a cavernous space filled with towering shelves of rotting fabric and shadows that seemed to move on their own. "The flare won't keep it busy long," Silas panted, his chest heaving. "It's tasted your blood on that swipe, Henry. It's marked you. It won't stop until the sun comes up, or until there's nothing left of us to bury." I looked down at my arm. I haven't even felt a scratch, but my sleeve was soaked in red. The room began to spin. "Why did you come back for me?" I asked, trying to steady my breathing. Silas looked at the door as it shuddered under another blow. "Because I let the last guard die 10 years ago," he said, his eyes filled with a century of regret. I heard him calling for help, and I stayed in my house and locked the door. I won't have two ghosts on my conscience. He handed me a canister of industrial-grade accelerant he'd grabbed from a shelf. If it gets in, we turn this whole place into a furnace. It's the only way to kill a hunger this old. You have to burn the heart out of it. We retreated deeper into the warehouse toward the foreman's office. The only room with reinforced concrete walls. But as we moved, I realized the scratching on the door had stopped. The silence returned heavier than before. Then, from high above, in the rafters, 3 stories up in the dark, we heard the sound of glass shattering. It hadn't given up on the door, it had found the skylights. The sound of the creature moving through the rafters was like a dry wind rustling through a graveyard. We couldn't see it, but we could hear it, the structural steel groaning as that skeletal weight shifted from beam to beam. "To the office, Henry, don't look up," Silas hissed, his grip tightening on the axe. We sprinted across the concrete floor, our boots echoing like thunder, but I could feel those yellow eyes tracking the heat of my pulse from the darkness above. Just as we reached the heavy door of the foreman's office, the creature dropped, not behind us, but directly in front, cutting off our only escape. It landed in a crouch, its limbs folding like a dead spider's, and then it stood, unfolding until its head nearly brushed the low-hanging lights. It was larger than it had been an hour ago. The lore was true. It grew with the hunt, its greed manifesting as a physical stretching of its horrific frame. It looked at Silas, and then it looked at me, and its jaw unhinged in a way no living things should. "Silas," it croaked, but the voice it used was the voice of the guard Silas had left to die 10 years ago. "You let me burn." The old man staggered back, the axe trembling in his hands as the guilt he'd carried for a decade was weaponized against him. "It's not him, Silas," I screamed, lunging forward. I didn't use the shotgun. I grabbed the pouch Silas had given me earlier, the one with the mountain ash and silver. I didn't know if it would work, but I threw the contents directly into the creature's face. The effect was instantaneous. Where the powder hit the grey flesh, it hissed and smoked as if it were acid. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that shattered the remaining windows in the office partition. "The accelerant, now!" Silas roared, snapping out of his trance. I doused the floor between us and the beast with the industrial solvent, the fumes stinging my eyes. The creature lunged through a cloud of ash, its claws missing my throat by a fraction of an inch and tearing a deep furrow into the concrete wall instead. Silas swung the axe, burying the blade in the creature's side, but it didn't bleed red. A thick black ichor that smelled of ancient rot oozed from the wound. The beast swiped back, sending Silas flying across the room like a rag doll. I was alone with it. My back was against the chemical drums, and the creature was leaning in, its lipless mouth open to reveal rows of needle teeth. I reached into my pocket and found my Zippo, a gift from Sarah for my last birthday. "Eat this," I whispered. I struck the flint and dropped the lighter into the pool of accelerant. The world turned into a roar of orange and white. The fire raced up the trail of liquid, engulfing the Wendigo in a pillar of flame. It didn't die quietly. It thrashed within the fire, its screams sounding like a roar of the damned, voices of dozens of victims overlapping in a final, horrific crescendo. I grabbed Silas, dragging his semi-conscious body toward the emergency exit as the fire began to feed on the decades of dry fabric and dust in the warehouse. We tumbled out into the cold morning air just as the first rays of dawn began to bleed over the horizon. Behind us, the warehouse was a funeral pyre, the black smoke rising straight into the calm, windless sky. We sat on the tailgate of my truck, watching the building collapse into a skeleton of glowing ribs. Silas didn't say a word. He just stared at the flames, the weight on his shoulders finally looking a little lighter. I never went back for my final paycheck. I drove back to San Francisco that same day, and I didn't stop until I saw the Golden Gate Bridge through the fog. People ask me why I don't go hunting anymore, or why I can't stand the sound of someone mimicking a voice in a joke. I just tell them I've seen what happens when hunger becomes a god. And if you are ever in the North Carolina woods and you hear your name called from the pines, keep driving. Don't look back, because some things in this world are hungrier than you can ever imagine.